Teaching scope and purpose. When our Creator says that we should rest on the 15th day of the first month, or observe Shabbat, the Sabbath, on the 7th day, when does a day in that context specifically start and stop? This debate is often framed by two opposing perspectives. Does Shabbat start when the sun goes down or when the sun comes up? Which one is it? Why does this even matter? Well, it matters to the degree that we wish to observe the Sabbath or any other appointed time correctly. We all desire to follow our Creator as He intended. We love Him and seek to walk out His Word the best that we are able. If we observe the Sabbath starting when the sun goes down, and the Torah states that the Sabbath begins when the sun goes up, not only will we be starting the Sabbath early, but we will end the Sabbath prematurely when the sun goes down, thus causing us to violate His Word. Likewise, if we observe the Sabbath starting when the sun comes up, and the Torah states the Sabbath begins when the sun goes down, we would be late in our observing of our Sabbath, and thus violate His Word. In this teaching, we intend on accurately defining a day by determining the scope of when a day begins and ends. So, what is a day? The Hebrew word for day is yom. This word is presented to us rather early in the Scriptures. We first find it in Genesis chapter 1, verse 5. God called the light day, yom, and the darkness He called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. The first thing one might notice is that a day is defined as when it is light. Because of this, there exists a minority that suggests that every time day is mentioned, that it is simply referring to daylight, not a 24-hour period. While that would be quite fantastic to have such a simple definition of a day, it appears that the Hebrew word yom, as day, is used in the same way that the English word for day is used. While it can simply refer to daylight when immediately contrasted against night, when used in isolation, day can often represent a 24-hour period of both day and night. There are numerous examples in the Scriptures to reveal the duality of the usage of yom. We will offer just 3 examples to establish the concept of yom referring to a 24-hour period of day and night. Numbers chapter 19, verse 11. Whoever touches the dead body of any person shall be unclean 7 days. Yom. If a day was to simply mean only daylight in this example, that would mean that a person's only unclean during daylight, but at night they would be considered clean. Obviously, Yahweh did not intend for us to understand it in this way. A day here is a 24-hour period. Numbers 14. And he who is to be cleansed shall wash his clothes and shave off all his hair and bathe himself in water, and he shall be clean. And after he may come into the camp, but live outside his tent 7 days. In this instance, if we were to understand day only to be defined as daylight, that would mean that during the day, he could stay outside his tent, but at night, he could enter his tent. Obviously, Yahweh did not intend for us to understand it in this way either. A day here is a 24-hour period. Our Messiah gave us a prophecy in which he stated that he would be in the heart of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights, clearly distinguishing between day and night. Matthew chapter 12, verse 40. For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. When day is contrasted with night in Israel, a day is about 12 hours and a night is about 12 hours. A day here is about a 12-hour period. In John chapter 2, Yeshua references the same prophecy of 3 days and 3 nights and summarizes the 3 days and 3 nights as just 3 days. John chapter 2, verse 19. Yeshua answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." So the same prophecy can equate 3 days and 3 nights as equal to 3 days. There are many more examples such as this, illustrating that while a day can mean just daylight in its strictest sense, it is also biblically accurate to understand Yom to refer to both a complete day and night. That duality in properly understanding the biblical application of Yom may be offered to us in its first usage in Genesis chapter 1. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening and there was morning the first day. The first usage of Yom defines it as daylight and is immediately contrasted against night. Day and night are clearly opposites. The second usage of Yom as a day is defined to include both evening and morning. Evening and morning are also opposites. This will be important later. We will further define an evening and morning in just a moment. First, we need to examine the pattern Genesis 1 sets up for us. Establishing the pattern. It does not take much study of the Scriptures to realize that His Word is built on patterns. These patterns repeat. These patterns do not violate each other or conflict with one another. The patterns in Scripture are there for a purpose. The patterns assist us in revealing to us error should we interpret something incorrectly. If we interpret something in the Torah and we find it goes against the biblically established and repeated pattern, that should be evidence to us that something is clearly off and needs to be reconciled. Thus, the first thing we should want to do in establishing what comes first, night or day, is to seek out the pattern in His Word. This is important. There was no light in the beginning. The beginning did not start when there was light. The beginning started when there was no light. Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. First, darkness. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And then light. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Please allow us to repeat that, because this is perhaps the most important principle that needs to be recognized. There was no light in the beginning. The beginning did not start when there was light. The beginning started when there was no light. We are emphasizing this because some try to state that the beginning was when there was light. The Bible is clear that the beginning was when there was no light. There was no light. There was only darkness in the beginning. Some might say that Yahweh was there in the beginning, and Yahweh, He is light. Well, that is indeed very true. Yahweh is light, and we can't argue with that. Yahweh is light. But in the beginning, there was no light. Not before the beginning there was no light, but in the beginning there was no light. Jeremiah agrees with us. There was no light in the beginning. None. Jeremiah chapter 4. I looked on the earth, and behold, it was without form and void, and to the heavens, and they had no light. So someone might say, if there was no light in the beginning, and Yahweh is light, does that mean Yahweh was not there? That would not make any sense. No, Yahweh was there. But surprising to some, Yahweh can hide Himself in darkness for His purposes. 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 12. Then Solomon said, Yahweh has said that He would dwell in thick darkness. Yahweh dwells in darkness until His word, which is light, goes forth from Him. That is what occurred on the first full day. There was darkness until Yah spoke His word, which was light. Genesis 1, 1 through 3. First, darkness. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Then light. And God said, Let there be light, and there was light. Again, Yahweh can hide Himself in darkness for his purposes. Psalm 18:11. He, Yahweh, made darkness his covering, his canopy around him, thick clouds dark with water. Did you see the usage of darkness and covering here? Let's read it again, Psalm 18. He, Yahweh, made darkness his covering, his canopy around him, thick clouds dark with water. This is important as it is intentional. Remember, darkness, covering, Yahweh. That will be important in just a moment. This brings us back to the first evening and morning found in Genesis chapter 1. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening and there was morning the first day. The first 24-hour period contained an evening first and then a morning. Darkness is night. Evening is the beginning of night. Here's Strong's definition of the Hebrew word for evening. Evening, twilight, dusk, the fading of the day. Twilight can extend into the dark of the night. The Hebrew word areb, as mixing, comes from the root word arab, which means darkened as in the idea of covering with a texture. Darkened as an idea of covering with a texture. Remember again Psalm 18. Darkness, covering, Yahweh. Psalm 18:11. He, Yahweh, made darkness his covering, his canopy around him, thick clouds dark with water. This is exactly what Yahweh did in the beginning. His light was covered in the texture of darkness, which is defined as an evening. Jeremiah 4:23. I looked on the earth, and behold, it was without form and void, and to the heavens, and they had no light. Yahweh then spoke, and that was light. The light then broke through the darkness and separated the two. First there is no light, or there is darkness, and then there is light. On day 4, the sun then created night and day in that order. We can determine this biblically established principle simply by examining the first few sentences of the Bible. Darkness first, and then light. But some might say something like the following. We are to walk in the light, not walk in darkness. Read all these related verses. John chapter 8, John chapter 11, John chapter 12, John chapter 9. And to that, we fully agree. That is so right. We are to walk in the light. But let us ask an important question. Were we first born in the light, or were we born in darkness, and then we came into the light? Did that just connect with you? We are to walk in the light, of course. But were we first born in the light, or were we born in darkness, and then we came into the light? What came first, darkness or light? Darkness, of course. So then, we can see how the spiritual even agrees with the physical pattern outlined in Genesis chapter 1. A 24-hour period has both night and day. So if we're going to look at the spiritual realm and how the pattern works there to apply the same pattern in the physical realm, then let's really apply it. Again, what came first in our lives? Darkness and then light, or light and then darkness? Do you see? The spiritual teaches the physical, and the physical teaches the spiritual. When we were born as creatures of the light, we were first creatures of darkness, and then we came into the light of the Word of God. First darkness and then light. First we were in darkness, and then we came into the light. That is why in the beginning it is said in Genesis that at first there was darkness, or by Jeremiah that at first there was no light. Then our Creator spoke, and the Word went forth. It is the Word that is light. When we become believers, the Word goes forth in us, and we were reborn from darkness into the light. Likewise, in the beginning, there was night number 1, then day number 1, then night number 2, then day number 2, and so on and so on. The sun follows that pattern, first darkness or night, and then there is light or day. Genesis 1 teaches us our own spiritual process. First darkness. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And then light. And then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. The pattern set forth from the beginning was darkness first and then light, and that defined one calendar day. So it should be obvious by now that we are advocating that a biblical 24-hour period begins at night. But when exactly does the first day of the month become the second day of the month? Is it at the moment that the sun touches the horizon? Is it at the moment the sun dips below the horizon? Is it the moment that it goes completely dark? Here is one thing to remember. Hebraic thinking is not Greek thinking. Greek thinking forces us to use an atomic clock to dictate the exact nanosecond a new day starts. Hebraic thinking functions differently. In Hebraic thinking, a day does not suddenly become a new day like a flip of a switch, though that is what most of us are used to. And it is often difficult to think differently. Days blend together as light mixes with darkness. As the sun touches the horizon, a new day is starting the same time the previous day is ending. This process continues until the next day fully arrives and the previous day fully ends. So there is a period between sunset and darkness in which days are basically blending together. This is to teach us that mixing and confusion brings us into darkness. Yahweh then brings us out of that darkness into light. Of course, this is with the night then day model. Using a day then night model, that would teach us that we start in light and then confusion and mixing happens after we enter the light, until we conclude in darkness. We would hope that does not sound right to you, because it isn't. Remember, even our Messiah came in darkness to bring light. We cannot emphasize the biblical pattern enough. First darkness, then light. Matthew chapter 4. Now when he heard that John had been arrested, he withdrew into Galilee. And leaving Nazareth, he went and lived in Capernaum by the sea, in the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali, so that what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled. The land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, by the way of the sea, beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles, the people dwelling in darkness have seen a great light. Darkness, then light. For those dwelling in the region and shadow of death, on them a light has dawned. From that time, Yeshua began to preach, saying, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand." When our Messiah returns, first darkness, then light. Isaiah chapter 60. For behold, darkness shall cover the earth, and thick darkness the peoples. But Yahweh will arise upon you, and his glory, or light, will be seen upon you. Ezekiel 34. As a shepherd seeks out his flock when he is among his sheep that have been scattered, so will I seek out my sheep, and I will rescue them from all places where they have been scattered on a day of clouds and thick darkness. Joel chapter 2. The sun shall be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. Amos chapter 5. Woe to you who desire the day of the Lord. Why would you have the day of the Lord? It is darkness and not light. And in verse 20, is not the day of the Lord darkness and not light, and gloom with no brightness in it? In the beginning, the darkness is removed by the light. In the end, the darkness is removed by the light. Why? Because the end is revealed from the beginning. Isaiah 46. Declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things not yet done, saying, My counsel shall stand, and I will accomplish all my purpose. So, the next day would fully begin once darkness has fully arrived. For example, for Shabbat, we would want to start winding down around sunset, as Shabbat is entering in, and then cease all work by the time it is fully dark. You may have noticed that this is how the Jews today also interpret a day, first night, then daylight. We are not agreeing with the Jews on this matter simply because it may seem convenient. If you have watched any of our other calendar teachings, it should be noted that we disagree on several other points on the Orthodox Jews' understanding of the biblical calendar. We do believe, however, that this is an understanding of the calendar that Jews do have correct. As illustrated, the night first, then day is the biblical pattern established from the beginning, because once again, in the beginning, there was no light. What we have established so far is that the beginning establishes a night first and then a day. We even see that pattern present itself in the spiritual realm to also teach us the spiritual order. We will see this present itself as a thread throughout the whole Bible, which will be our focus in part 2 of this teaching, as we go through numerous verses one by one. In part 1 of this series, we covered foundational material. We learned that in the beginning, night came first, and then day. We also learned how that the physical concept also relates back to the spiritual realm. We were born into darkness, and we come into the light when we come into the Word of God. So the physical reality is darkness first and then light. The same is true for our own spiritual reality, first darkness and then light. We also discovered how a day does not become a new day, like a flip of a switch. A new day begins as the previous day ends. This transition occurs as the sun begins to set. When the sun is setting, the day is ending, and the next day is also beginning. For a time, 2 days are blending or mixing together. Once it is completely dark, meaning no light from the sun, the previous day has fully ended and the new day has fully arrived. We would expect that what was established in the beginning to present itself as valid in the rest of Scripture. The subsequent parts of this series will do just that. We will now begin to test the expectation that darkness is first and then light, as it relates to a full 24-hour period. The Exodus. The Exodus includes the first documented Passover and is one of the most enlightening examples of when a Hebraic 24-hour period starts. We see that the Passover is sacrificed during the portion of the 14th day of the first month. Israel then eats of the Passover that night, which is defined as the 15th day of the first month. Israel leaves Egypt the same night, still being the 15th day of the month. It needs to be noted that this is before morning even arrives. This would prove without a doubt that the order established in the beginning in Genesis 1 is still being followed in the time of the Exodus. If a Hebraic 24-hour period was a day first and then night model, then the Israelites would have left the night of the 14th, not the 15th, because according to the day first then night model, the 15th day would not have arrived until morning. Yet we see that such does not happen. Let's examine all of this more closely. The Israelites kept the lamb until the 14th day of the month. Exodus chapter 12. Tell all the congregation of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, every man shall take a lamb according to their fathers' houses, a lamb for a household. And if the household is too small for a lamb, then he and his nearest neighbor shall take according to the number of persons. According to what each can eat, you shall make your count for the lamb. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male a year old. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats, and you shall keep it until the 14th day of this month, when the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill their lambs at twilight, or between the evenings. The lamb was sacrificed at twilight. This would allow a few hours to prepare and cook the Passover by fire. The Passover was then eaten that night. Exodus 12:8. They shall eat the flesh that night. Roasted on the fire with unleavened bread and bitter herbs, they shall eat it. We are also told that it is a feast unto Yahweh. Exodus 12:14. This day shall be for you a memorial day. You shall keep it as a feast to Yahweh throughout your generations. As a statute forever, you shall keep it as a feast. This feast, in which the Passover lamb, unleavened bread, and bitter herb are all eaten, is called the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So when is the Passover Seder, or more biblically accurate, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, to be eaten? Answer: on the 15th day of the first Hebraic month, Leviticus 23. And on the 15th day of the same month is the Feast of Unleavened Bread to Yahweh. For 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. This also agrees with Exodus 12. And you shall observe the Feast of Unleavened Bread, for on this very day I brought your hosts out of the land of Egypt. This is why the Feast of Unleavened Bread and the Passover meal are stated to be the same day, the same feast. Mark 14, verse 1. It was now 2 days before Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. and the chief priest and the scribes were seeking how to arrest him by stealth and kill him. The day that Israel was brought out of Egypt was at night. Deuteronomy chapter 16. Observe the month of Aviv and keep the Passover to Yahweh your God. For in the month of Aviv, Yahweh your God brought you out of Egypt by night. And Numbers 33 verse 3. They set out from Ramses in the first month, on the 15th day of the first month. On the day after the Passover, the people of Israel went out triumphantly in the sight of all the Egyptians. Israel observed the Passover or killed the Passover on the 14th day, during the day around 3 p.m. as commanded. The Passover is when the Passover lamb was to be slain. Exodus 12 verses 5 through 6. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male a year old. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats, and you shall keep it until the 14th day of this month, when the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill their lambs at twilight, or between the evenings. Leviticus 23 verse 5. And the first month, on the 14th day of the month at twilight, is Yahweh's Passover. The Passover is on the 14th day, being the time that the Passover was killed. Numbers 33 verse 3 declares that Israel left the day after the Passover, which would mean that they left on the 15th day of the month. Numbers 33 verse 3. They set out from Ramses in the first month, on the 15th day of the first month, on the day after the Passover, when it was slain. The people of Israel went out triumphantly in the sight of all of the Egyptians. And of course, that was the night of the 15th. Deuteronomy 16 verse 1. Observe the month of Aviv and keep the Passover to Yahweh your God. For in the month of Aviv, Yahweh your God brought you out of Egypt by night. In summary, here's the order of events. Number 1, Israel identifies a lamb on the 10th day of the month. Number 2, Israel sacrifices the Passover lamb at 3 p.m. on the 14th day. This is called the day of the Passover. Number 3, Israel eats of the Passover lamb that night. Number 4, Israel eats in haste, belts fastened, with the sandals on their feet, and staffs in their hand, so they are ready to go at a moment's notice that same night. Number 5, eating the Passover lamb that night is called the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and is declared to be the day that Yahweh brought Israel out of Egypt. The Feast of Unleavened Bread is declared to be on the 15th day of the month. Notice that morning has not yet occurred. Number 6, in the middle of the night, Yahweh struck down the firstborn of Egypt. Number 7, Pharaoh and all the Egyptians woke in the middle of that same night. Number 8, Moses and Aaron were summoned to see Pharaoh in the middle of that same night and tells Israel to leave. Number 9, the Egyptians were urgent and told Israel to leave in haste that same night, the 15th day of the month. Notice in all of this, and this is important, we went from the 14th day in which the Passover was sacrificed to the 15th day before morning even occurred. Thus, the 24-hour Hebraic day does not and cannot start in the morning. A morning then evening Hebraic day model is not compatible with the events outlined in the Exodus. The Passover is eaten on the 15th day of the month, which was defined as the night following the killing of the Passover on the 14th. Israel left that same night. A morning then evening Hebraic model forces the eating of the Passover on the 14th day of the month, as the night following the killing of the Passover lamb is then considered to be the same day. This would also mean that Israel eating in haste, with belts fastened, sandals on their feet, and staffs in their hand, was all for nothing if they were leaving over 24 hours later instead of the same night that they ate of the Passover. Objections. Despite the conflicts that would occur in a morning then evening model, there still are a few objections that need to be addressed. Israel is supposed to stay in their dwellings until morning. How then could Israel have left that same night? We know that Moses and Aaron certainly did not stay in their homes. Exodus 12 verse 31. Then he summoned Moses and Aaron by night and said, "Up, go out from among my people, both you and the people of Israel, and go, serve Yahweh as you have said." So why could Moses and Aaron leave? Did Moses and Aaron break a commandment from Yahweh? No, of course not. The answer is in Exodus chapter 12, verses 21 through 22. Everything previous to verse 21 is Yahweh speaking commandments to Israel. Everything after verse 21 is Moses speaking. Yahweh never stated to Moses to tell Israel to stay in their houses until morning. Yahweh told Moses that Yahweh will pass over houses marked in blood sometime during the night. Since Moses had no idea exactly what time this would occur, it was just common sense to instruct Israel to stay in their houses until morning. Obviously, though, once all firstborn had died, or a house was passed over from death, it was then safe to leave the house, as Moses and Aaron did when they went to go see Ramses. This is why we do not see such a commandment repeated in Deuteronomy, Leviticus, or Numbers. The instruction to Israel to not leave the house till morning was from Moses, not Yahweh, and simply based on common sense. Israel was to burn anything left over in the morning. If they left that night, how could they have accomplished that? Israel is also commanded to not have anything left over and to eat in haste. Should they have had anything left over, it could have been brought with them during the Exodus and burned in the morning. Exodus 12, verses 31 through 36, implies that they plundered the Egyptians after the firstborn had died. How would that have occurred that night? All of Egypt was already awake. All of Egypt wanted to send out Israel in haste, meaning immediately. Get out of here, not 24 hours later. Yahweh prepared Israel in advance to leave in haste. This would have all occurred that night. Leviticus 23, verses 5 through 6, does not say that the Passover meal must be eaten on the 15th. Passover is referred to as a feast. Mark 14, verse 1, also declares the timing of the eating of the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread to be on the same day. Luke 22, verse 1 states that the Feast of Unleavened Bread is called the Passover. The reason is that the Passover lamb becomes a feast. The only feast that makes sense is the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is stated to be on the 15th of the first month. The 14th is when the Passover is slain. The 15th is when the Passover meal occurred. Leviticus 23, verse 5, is noting the timing of the Passover sacrifice as between the evenings, which agrees verbatim with Exodus 12, verse 6. In conclusion, it is impossible for a morning then evening model to be reconciled with the events of the Exodus. The only model that does work is the evening then morning, which also agrees with Genesis chapter 1. Yom Kippur. Leviticus 23, verse 27. Now on the 10th day of the 7th month is the Day of Atonement. It shall be for you a time of holy convocation, and you shall afflict yourselves and present yourself a food offering to Yahweh. When does the 10th day begin, according to Yahweh? On the morning of the 10th or the evening of the 9th? Leviticus 23:32. It shall be to you a Sabbath of solemn rest, and you shall afflict yourselves. On the 9th day of the month, beginning at evening, from evening to evening, shall you keep your Sabbath. So why does it state that Yom Kippur is on the 10th day in verse 27? But in verse 32, it says that Yom Kippur starts on the evening of the 9th. How confusing is that? Remember what we already learned. Days blend together in the evening. In the evening of the 9th, the 10th day is beginning, just as the 9th day is ending. It's not a flip of the switch. It's Hebraic thinking, not Greek thinking. This actually proves that a day is evening to evening, or at least a full 24-hour period day. And this demonstrates the biblical concept that days blend or mix together in the evening. Nehemiah 13. As soon as it began to grow dark at the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I commanded that the doors should be shut and gave the orders that they should not be opened until after the Sabbath, as I stationed some of my servants at the gates, that no load might be brought in on the Sabbath day. As we just illustrated earlier with Yom Kippur, the Sabbath begins when it is dark, when the sun is set. Began to be dark is the time when the sun is just beginning to set, just before the Sabbath, as Nehemiah just said. The gates were closed just before the Sabbath commenced. The phrase began to be dark before the Sabbath clearly indicates that the Sabbath began when it was dark. Began to be dark means the darkness was imminent. Darkness followed not later, but immediately. Before the Sabbath means the Sabbath was also imminent. The Sabbath followed not later, but immediately. Nehemiah was interested in no load being brought in on the Sabbath day. His problem was not with merchants coming before the Sabbath day. If the Sabbath began in the morning, then why would he have forced the merchants to be outside the gates at night if the issue was about carrying a load on the Sabbath? If the Sabbath was actually beginning in the morning, then it could not be interpreted that the merchants were carrying a load on the Sabbath. Not only that, but why did he force them to sleep outside the wall if it was not the Sabbath yet for another 12 hours? If the Sabbath starts in the morning, why would Nehemiah close the gates for 36 hours starting at evening? Some state that it was common practice to shut the gates in the evening. If that is true, and it is such common practice, then why did the merchants not understand that they should get there before dark? And if closing the gates at night was common practice, then how were the merchants carrying a load before? It simply does not make any sense for Nehemiah to do what he did under the pretense of not carrying a load on the Sabbath if the Sabbath did not even start for another 12 hours, meaning in the morning. In part 1 of this series, we covered foundational material. We learned that in the beginning, night came first, and then day. We also learned how that physical concept relates back to the spiritual realm. We were born in darkness, and we came into the light when we came into the Word of God. In part 2 of this series, we learned how the rest of the Tanakh, or the Old Testament, confirms this understanding in the application of a night first and then day model of a 24-hour Hebraic day. In the final teaching on this subject, we will cover some supportive scripture in the Brit Hadashah, or the New Testament, as well as answer some common objections to the night first and then day model. So let's get started in looking at some of the verses in the New Testament. The death of our Messiah. An individual put to death on a tree was to be buried that same day. Deuteronomy 21, verses 22 through 23. And if a man has committed a crime punishable by death, and he is put to death, and you hang him on a tree, this body shall not remain all night on the tree, but you shall bury him the same day. For a hanged man is cursed by God. You shall not defile your land that Yahweh your God is giving you for an inheritance. Joshua, who shares the same Hebrew name as our Messiah, practiced this commandment. Joshua 8:29. And he hanged the king of Ai on the tree until evening. And at sunset Joshua commanded, and they took down his body from the tree and threw it at the entrance of the gate of the city, and raised over it a great heap of stones, which stands there to this day. This commandment was also observed for our Messiah. John 19, verse 31. Since it was the day of preparation, the 14th day of the first month, and so that the bodies would not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a high day, the Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken and that they might be taken away. According to Deuteronomy chapter 21, the bodies were to be taken down the same day. How much more so when it was before a Sabbath night? If this Sabbath only began at sunrise, then why were they rushing to break the legs of the thieves and take them down from the cross nearly 15 hours before the Sabbath began? There is no command in the Old Testament that the body should not remain on the cross on the Sabbath. The command in the Torah was the body should be taken down that same day. It does not say in John 19:31 that the body should not remain on the cross at night, but that the body should not remain upon the cross on the Sabbath day. According to the Torah, the body should be taken down before the end of that day. John 19:31 correlates that Torah commandment with the beginning of the Sabbath. This clearly implies that the Sabbath started that night, after sunset, and not at sunrise. This man went unto Pilate and begged the body of Yeshua, and that day was the preparation, and the Sabbath drew on. The Revised Standard Version translates Luke 23:54 in this way. It was the day of preparation, and the Sabbath was beginning. The Sabbath drew on, or the Sabbath was beginning, does not make sense if the Sabbath was beginning nearly 15 hours later. This again shows that the Hebraic day began not at sunrise, but at sunset, which was the beginning of the high Sabbath for the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The resurrection. John gives us the period during which Mary Magdalene visited the tomb to anoint the body of Yeshua. John chapter 20, verse 1. Now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early, while it was still dark, and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. When it was still dark means that the sunrise had not yet taken place. John calls this time the time before sunrise as the first day of the week. This proves that the first day of the week started even before the sun could rise. That means that the first day of the week, according to John, did not start at sunrise, but at sunset the previous night. Yet we know that Yeshua rose as the first fruits before it was light. The stone was already rolled away. John chapter 20, verse 1. Now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early, while it was still dark, and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. So, once again, after sunset, but before morning, was biblically defined as the next day. Objections to a night first, then day model. There are some objections to a Hebraic day beginning at night. In this section, we would like to address some of those. Exodus 10:13. So Moses stretched out his staff over the land of Egypt, and Yahweh brought an east wind upon the land all that day and all that night. When it was morning, the east wind had brought the locusts. So here it is argued that that day belongs to that night, thus proving that day is first and then night. It is a valid point, at least in the English. The argument hinges on the word that, prefacing both day and night. In the Hebrew, that day is not connected with that night. It suddenly becomes the night. For example, let's examine a literal Hebrew translation. Exodus 10:13, Young's literal translation. And Moses stretcheth out his rod against the land of Egypt, and Jehovah hath led an east wind over the land all that day and all the night. The morning hath been, and the east wind hath lifted up the locust. As we can see, when we examine the literal Hebrew, the previous day is not connected to the following night. So what we discover is that Exodus 10:13 actually supports a night first and then day model of the 24-hour Hebraic day. Exodus 16. On the 6th day they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers each. And when all the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses, he said to them, This is what Yahweh has commanded. Tomorrow is a day of solemn rest, a holy Sabbath to Yahweh. Bake what you will bake and boil what you will boil, and all that is left over lay aside to be kept till morning. So they laid it aside till the morning, as Moses commanded them. And it did not stink, and there were no worms in it. Moses said, Eat it today, for today is a Sabbath to Yahweh. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the 7th day, which is a Sabbath, there will be none. On the seventh day, some of the people went out to gather, but they found none. So here it is argued that the next day was a Shabbat, proving that the day begins the next 24-hour Hebraic day because they gathered it on the sixth day, and in the morning, it was the seventh day. In reality, this does not support either a day first or night first model. They collected bread during the daylight on the sixth day. They kept the bread until morning, meaning they had to go through a night to arrive at a morning. This event is compatible with both 24-hour models. Whether one subscribes to a day first or night first model, the morning after the sixth day would always be the seventh day. Exodus 18:13. The next day Moses sat to judge the people, and the people stood around Moses from morning till evening. Here it is argued from morning till evening was the next day. This is true. Whether one subscribes to a day first or night first model, morning till evening would always be the next day. In this context, focus on morning to evening fits the time as daylight, in which the congregation would approach Moses for decisions. Thus, in the interest of determining what comes first, day or night, this verse does not help either position. Exodus 32, verses 5 through 6. When Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made a proclamation and said, "Tomorrow shall be a feast to Yahweh." And they rose up early the next day, and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings. And the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Here it is argued that tomorrow is a festival to Yahweh, and they rose on the next day. Whether one subscribes to a day first or night first model, the next morning following the previous period of daylight would always be the next day. Thus, in the interest of determining what comes first, day or night, this verse does not help either position. Leviticus 6:20. This is the offering that Aaron and his sons shall offer to Yahweh on the day when he is anointed, a tenth of an ephah of fine flour as a regular grain offering, half of it in the morning and half it in the evening. Here it is argued that the offering was to be brought to Yahweh at the beginning of the day. However, it does not state that the offering was to be offered to Yahweh in the beginning of the day. It simply states that the offering schedule occurs in the morning and in the evening. The stating of either morning first or evening first does not help us decide anything in this debate. For example, sometimes evening is mentioned first. Daniel 8:26. The vision of the evenings and the mornings that has been told is true, but seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now. Or in the Psalms, Psalm 55:17. Evening and morning and at noon I utter my complaint and moan, and he hears my voice. Or Leviticus 24:3. Outside the veil of the testimony, in the tent of meeting, Aaron shall arrange it from evening to morning before Yahweh regularly. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations. Moving on. Leviticus 7:15. And the flesh of the sacrifice of his peace offerings for thanksgiving shall be eaten on the day of his offering. He shall not leave any of it until morning. The question becomes, how can you eat all of it the same day and not leave any of it till morning if your day starts at night? The answer here is in the context. In the subsequent verses, it discusses how some offerings would be eaten the next day. Normally, most people would begin eating again in the morning. Numbers 11, verse 32. And the people rose all that day and all night, and all the next day, and gathered the quail. Those who gathered least gathered 10 omers, and they spread them out for themselves all around the camp. Sometimes it is attempted here to connect the first day with the first night, as one complete Hebraic 24 hours. Day and night are opposites, and when contrasted against each other, it is speaking of 12-hour periods. This is defined in the beginning, in Genesis, and throughout the New Testament, and we already offered several examples of this earlier in the teaching. This verse is not defining 24-hour Hebraic days, but simply stating that the gathering of quail began during the daylight, extended through the night, and lasted into the following period of daylight. To attempt to make this verse define a 24-hour Hebraic day is not fair to the context. There are two periods of daylight, and in context, a first yom and a second yom. Moving on to the next objection. Joshua chapter 7, 6 through 13. Then Joshua tore his clothes and fell to the earth on his face before the ark of Yahweh until the evening, he and the elders of Israel. And they put dust on their heads, and Joshua said, Alas, Yahweh God, why have you brought this people over the Jordan at all, to give us into the hands of the Amorites, to destroy us? Would that we had been content to dwell beyond the Jordan? O Yahweh, what can I say, when Israel has turned their backs before their enemies? For the Canaanites and all the inhabitants of the land will hear of it, and will surround us and cut off our name from the earth. And what will you do for your great name? Yahweh said to Joshua, Get up. Why have you fallen on your face? Israel has sinned. They have transgressed my covenant that I commanded them. They have taken some of the devoted things. They have stolen and lied and put them among their own belongings. Therefore, the people of Israel cannot stand before their enemies. They turn their backs before their enemies, because they have become devoted for destruction. I will be with you no more, unless you destroy the devoted things from among you. Get up, consecrate the people, and say, Consecrate yourselves for tomorrow. For thus says Yahweh, God of Israel, There are devoted things in your midst, O Israel. You cannot stand before your enemies until you take away the devoted things from among you. Here it is declared that Joshua fell before Yahweh until evening. Thus, evening cannot be the start of the next day, because Yahweh mentions that the people should consecrate themselves for tomorrow. However, we also agree that a new day does not start at evening. Evening is the period lasting from before sunset until it is completely dark. We covered that in the beginning of this teaching series. So evening includes the transition from the previous day into the new day. In the next chapter, for example, evening is mentioned to be before and up to the moment of sunset. Joshua chapter 8. And he hanged the king of Ai on the tree until evening. And at sunset Joshua commanded, and they took his body down from the tree and threw it at the entrance of the gate of the city and raised over it a great heap of stones, which stands there to this day. As we have defined earlier in this teaching, a new day does not begin like a flip of a switch. Days blend together until it is fully dark. When Joshua fell before Yahweh until evening, it could have been just before sunset or at sunset, just like Joshua chapter 9 demonstrates. It may have not been completely dark and thus not a new day. Also, if you have seen our teaching was the Last Supper, a Passover meal. We review the Hebraic understanding that there are 2 evenings per day, one evening starting after noon and one evening that is around sunset. Thus, this time frame spoken of here with Joshua could have been any time between noon and sunset, or even extending after sunset into dark. So when Yahweh states that tomorrow the people must consecrate themselves, that is completely compatible with either a night first or a day first model. These verses do nothing to support either position. Judges chapter 19, verse 9. When the man and his concubine and his servant rose up to depart, his father-in-law, the girl's father, said to him, Behold, now the day has waned toward evening. Please spend the night. Behold, the day draws to its close. Lodge here and let your heart be merry, and tomorrow you shall arise early in the morning for your journey and go home. It is sometimes said that here the tomorrow is equated to a new 24-hour Hebraic day. However, did you notice something? The day defined as drawing to the close is when the day has waned toward evening. There is less support here for a full Hebraic day starting in the morning, and significant evidence that the Hebraic 24-hour period is ending in the evening. 1 Samuel 19, 10 through 11. And Saul sought to pin David to the wall with the spear, but he eluded Saul, so that he struck the spear into the wall. And David fled and escaped that night. Saul sent messengers to David's house to watch him, that he might kill him in the morning. But Michal, David's wife, told him, If you do not escape with your life tonight, tomorrow you will be killed. It was already night when David was told to flee in the morning. which is defined as tomorrow. This would suggest that a new Hebraic 24-hour period does indeed begin in the morning. While mahar often does mean tomorrow, it can simply mean the time to come or later. Strong's H309. Tomorrow, in time to come, in the future tomorrow, as in the day following the present day, or a future time. For example, Genesis 30, verse 33. So my honesty will answer for me later, when you come to look into my wages with you. Everyone that is not speckled and spotted among the goats, and black among the lambs, if found with me, shall be counted stolen. Here we can see that the word did not literally mean tomorrow. Another example, Exodus 14:14. In time to come, your son asks you, what does this mean? You shall say to him, by a strong hand Yahweh brought us out of Egypt, from the house of slavery. And we can see here again that this word does not always literally mean tomorrow. Since it is contrasted against that night, the time to come, or later, being referred to appears to be daylight or morning. These verses do nothing to support either position. 1 Samuel 28, verses 8 through 19. So Saul disguised himself and put on other garments and went, he and 2 men with him, and they came to the woman by night. And he said, divine for me by a spirit, and bring up for me whomever I shall name to you. The woman said to him, surely you know what Saul has done, how he has cut off the mediums and the necromancers from the land. Why then are you laying a trap for my life to bring about my death? But Saul swore to her by Yahweh, as Yahweh lives, no punishment shall come upon you for doing this thing. Then the woman said, whom shall I bring up for you? He said, bring up Samuel for me. When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice. And the woman said to Saul, why have you deceived me? You are Saul. The king said to her, do not be afraid. What do you see? And the woman said to Saul, I see a God coming up out of the earth. He said to her, what is his appearance? And she said, an old man is coming up, and he is wrapped in a robe. And Saul knew that it was Samuel, and he bowed with his face to the ground and paid homage. Then Samuel said to Saul, why have you disturbed me by bringing me up? Saul answered, I am in great distress, for the Philistines are warring against me, and God has turned away from me and answers me no more, either by prophets or by dreams. Therefore I have summoned you to tell me what I shall do. And Samuel said, why then do you ask me, since Yahweh has turned from you and become your enemy? Yahweh has done to you as he spoke by me. For Yahweh has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor, David, because you did not obey the voice of Yahweh and did not carry out his fierce wrath against Amalek. Therefore Yahweh has done this thing to you this day. Moreover, Yahweh will give Israel also with you into the hand of the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons shall be with me. Yahweh will give the army of Israel also into the hand of the Philistines. It is assumed that the aforementioned tomorrow was referring to the coming morning. However, the related verses do not conclusively prove an either day first then night model, nor a night first then day model. There is no way to know with complete certainty if the Hebrew word used in Scripture that we discussed earlier, mahar, refers to the next literal day or simply a later time. The actual timeline between 1 Samuel 28 and 1 Samuel 31 is not definitive. Thus, these verses do nothing to support either position. 1 Samuel 30:17. And David struck them down from twilight until the evening of the next day, and not a man of them escaped, except 400 young men, who mounted camels and fled. It is argued that the next day should not have to be defined if the 24-hour Hebraic day ends in the evening. However, it most certainly does. The evening extends from the time before sunset until sunset and extending into the night. It is actually because a day ends in the evening that it does need to be defined. If the mentioned time in the evening was before sunset, it would be the same day. If the mentioned time was after sunset extending into the dark, it would be the next day. In fact, if the 24-hour Hebraic day began in the morning It is then that the mention of evening to evening does not require noting that it was the next day, as evening is well after morning. If anything, this verse appears to be strong support for a first night, then day model of the Hebraic day beginning. 2 Samuel chapter 24. So Gad came to David and told him and said to him, "Shall 3 years of famine come to you in your land? Or will you flee 3 months before your foes while they pursue you? Or shall there be 3 days pestilence in your land? Now consider and decide what answer I shall return to him who sent me." Then David said to Gad, "I am in great distress. Let us fall into the hand of Yahweh, for his mercy is great, but let me not fall into the hand of man." So Yahweh sent a pestilence on Israel from the morning until the appointed time, and there died of the people from Dan to Beersheba 70,000 men. Here we note that the 3-day plague started in the morning. 3 days of pestilence could also be interpreted as encompassing 3 literal days. Because this section of verses does not define day as being 3 24-hour periods, but simply including 3 days, we are left without being able to use this set of scriptures to support either position. Just the same, sometimes things begin in the evening. Exodus 12:18. "In the first month, from the 14th day of the month at evening, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at evening." Moving on. Lamentations 3:22. "The steadfast love of Yahweh never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness." It is argued that they are new every morning because morning is a new day. This, of course, is an assumption. For example, being clean after being unclean begins in the evening. We would argue because that is a new day. Leviticus 11:24. "And by these you shall become unclean. Whoever touches their carcasses shall be unclean until the evening." Leviticus 11:25. "And whoever carries any part of their carcass shall wash his clothes and be unclean until the evening." Leviticus 11:27. "And all that walk on their paws among all the animals that go on all fours are unclean to you. Whoever touches their carcass shall be unclean until the evening." Leviticus 11:28. "And he who carries their carcass shall wash his clothes and be unclean until the evening. They are unclean to you." Moving on to the next objection. Jonah chapter 4. "Now Yahweh God appointed a plant and made it come up over Jonah, that it might be shade over his head, to save him from discomfort. So Jonah was exceedingly glad because of the plant. But when dawn came up the next day, God appointed a worm that attacked the plant, so that it withered." Here it is argued that when dawn came up, that it defined the next day. First of all, it does not state that dawn defines the next day. It states that when dawn came up, it was the next day. This is true no matter which model one subscribes to. The context of this story starts during the day of the previous day. A night then passes, causing morning to be the next day in either a day first then night model or a night first then day model. These 2 verses do nothing to support either position. Moving on. Zechariah 14:7. "And there shall be a unique day which is known to Yahweh, neither day nor night, but at evening time there shall be light." Because day is mentioned first and then night, it is presumed that daylight must begin a Hebraic day. If we are going to employ such a means of interpretation, then such reasoning should stand in all of Scripture. However, it does not. Sometimes night is mentioned as preceding day. For example, Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 33. "Who went before you in the way to seek you out a place to pitch your tents, in fire by night and in the cloud by day, to show you by what way you should go." So as we can see, whether day or night is mentioned first, it obviously does not bear any relevance to define a 24-hour Hebraic day. In Matthew 28:1, Mark 16:2, and Luke 24:1, it is argued that Shabbat ended at dawn. Matthew 28:1. "Now after the Sabbath, Toward the dawn of the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb. Yet, let's read Matthew 28:1 carefully. It was after the Sabbath, toward the dawn. When something is toward the dawn, it is not yet dawn, but close to dawn. However, it was already after the Sabbath, before it was dawn. This would demonstrate that the Sabbath ended as the sun went down, as it was not yet light when Mary Magdalene and the other Mary left to go see the tomb. Mark 16, verses 2 through 4. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb, and they were saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb?" And looking up, they saw that the stone had been rolled back. It was very large. When they arrived, it became light. Here it mentions that the sun had risen, and that the Sabbath has passed. They apparently left while it was still dark, per Matthew 28:1, and arrived when it was dark. However, it took the breaking of the day for them to realize that the stone had already been rolled back. Luke 24, verses 1 through 2. But on the first day of the week, at early dawn, they went to the tomb, taking the spices they had prepared, and they found the stone rolled away from the tomb. Luke summarizes the event and is consistent with both the Mark and Matthew accounts. John is the most clear and words it very similar to how Matthew did. John 20, verse 1. Now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early, while it was still dark, and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. Just like Matthew, John mentions that Mary arrived while it was still dark, going toward dawn. However, some try to suggest here that the word for dark here does not mean dark, but simply means a little dark. However, in every instance of the word, it is contrasted against the presence of light, as the opposite of light. For example, John chapter 12, verse 46. I have come into the world as light, so that whoever believes in me may not remain in darkness. Moving on, John chapter 6, verses 16 through 22. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Yeshua had not come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Yeshua walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." Then they were glad to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. On the next day, the crowd that remained on the other side of the sea saw that there had been only one boat there, and that Yeshua had not entered the boat with his disciples, but that his disciples had gone away alone. Here it is mentioned that when the next day occurs, it is following dark. However, the context of the story begins the previous day in the evening, and then it becomes dark as the next day. Another point worth mentioning is that evening and night are often contrasted against day, as in daylight. It does not necessarily mean that a new day had begun, but there had been a next period of daylight. In both the English language and the Hebrew culture, the word for day can refer to simply daylight, not necessarily a whole day. This is especially true when the context is contrasting the mentioned period of night, then day, or really daylight that follows afterwards. For example, Acts 4, verse 3. And they arrested them and put them in custody until the next day, for it was already evening. Acts 23, 31 through 32. So the soldiers, according to their instructions, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. And on the next day they returned to the barracks, letting the horsemen go on with him. The night and day are contrasted, as in night and daylight. As you can see, this is a challenging topic, and there is good reason as to why there exists a debate on this matter. We encourage you to study it out for yourselves, and regardless of what position you adopt, please be considerate of others as we are all striving to walk in His Word the best that we are able. We hope that this teaching has blessed you. And remember, continue to test everything. Shalom.